Very deserved to be had.
Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. Everyone online and in the room. My name is Frank Ruda, as most of you know. I'm here as professor for modern and contemporary philosophy. And I'm very pleased to welcome all of you online and in the room to another event in the philosophy speaker series here at University of Dundee. Before I briefly introduce our guest, Roberto Nigro, about whose presence I'm extremely pleased, and I've been meeting for a while. I'm introducing her. Let me briefly tell you and remind you of the two next events in the series. The next one is going to be a talk by Javi Carrel on the 30th of November. And afterwards, we're going to have Tim Ingalls on the 7th of December. Next year, we will welcome Stella Sanford from Kingston University, Michael Heinrich from Berlin, and Etienne Balibar from Paris, and Sophie Vanish also from Paris. Today, we're very lucky to be able to welcome Professor Roberto Nigro, about whom I'm just going to say a few things. He is right now, since 2016, professor for philosophy at the Leuphana University of Lüneburg, with a special focus on continental philosophy. He was previously a professeur invité at the Department of Philosophy at the Université de Paris Ouest Nanterre. From 2009 to 2016, he taught at in Zurich at the University of Arts, and he is a permanent directeur de programme at the Collège International de Philosophie in Paris. Of his numerous publications, I just want to single out the edited collection and collections and the books that he authored. He just told me a bit earlier that he just finished a book on Antonio Negri, which is going to come out in French next year. Earlier or before that, he edited What's Legit Critiques of Law Strategies, Critiques of Law and Strategies of Right. He wrote a book on regimes of truth and edited a collection on aesthetics of existence, also as a collection called Pouvoir, Violence, Représentation. Today we will speak about Discomfort in Contemporary Philosophy, the Italian operaism and its legacy at issue. I'm going to shut up and give Roberto the floor. Thank you for coming to Scotland. It's a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much, Frank, for this generous introduction and for inviting me. Thank you for everybody. I'm very happy to be here in Scotland. I must confess that nobody's perfect, but it's the first time I'm in London. This beautiful city with sunlight and with a beautiful weather. So I'm very pleased to have the possibility to share my thoughts with you, and in particular to have the possibility to discuss with you this topic. This topic that may sound a little bit too specific, but what I would like to do is just introduce a couple of questions that, from my point of view, are at the core of interesting discussions in contemporary field. So let me state briefly the focus of my talk today. So let me say briefly the focus on my talk today. I'm going to take into account two different perspectives at work in contemporary political philosophy. To make it clear, I will name these two perspectives, which can be traced back to two different philosophical traditions, Spinozism. I have to bother you.
Absolutely, no worry.
So Spinozism or political Spinozism on one side, and the second one, Nietzschean or Heideggerian Nietzschean legacy. I say I will give these two perspectives the name I'm indicating in order to make my account clear. In fact, I'm aware that these labels are unacceptable shortcuts, since each of the traditions I'm referring to involves a variety of positions that in no way can be reduced to a synthesis. Despite these difficulties and the awareness that different pathways in contemporary philosophy cannot be reduced to unity, I'm going to use the distinction you mentioned. Because I think that in doing so, it will be possible to sketch out some issues that are at stake in contemporary philosophy. My second preliminary remark concerns the end of my talk. By setting out from the two opposite perspectives, I'd like to reach a point where an impossible synthesis could take place. I say an impossible synthesis, not only because I'm aware of the inappropriateness of any form of synthesis, but also because the only synthesis I can conceive is one that looks like a disjunctive synthesis. To put it with the words of Gilles Deleuze and also Félix Guattari, when they use this formulation in order to refer to the movement of differences returning to themselves without stopping to be differences. Or, as Etienne Balibar has recently pointed out, so here I'm providing you with my translation, so for works that are not yet translated into other languages. So la synthèse est réelle, mais la disjonction demeure. Ce qui fait que la synthèse n'est pas une fusion politique, elle recouvre des conflits et des conflits dans les conflits, évoluant très rapidement avec la situation. But if I'm going to suggest a possible or impossible disjunctive synthesis between the two traditions I'm referring to, the reason for that lies in the fact that these two experiences of thought have emerged, so it seems to me, within a very specific historical conjuncture, that of the history of philosophy of the second half of the 20th century, which was characterized by political issues that were the point of departure for both forms of reflection. Put differently, both traditions attempted to answer in different ways common questions that have been at the bottom of modern and contemporary philosophy for a long time, and that have caused discomfort in contemporary philosophy. A discontent that cannot be overcome, but needed and still needs to be seriously taken into account. While there is no question of flattening the existing differences among different authors and philosophies, or what would be worse, of reducing them by referring to common rules, it is nevertheless a fact that many authors who have been working for several decades in different trajectories have all moved by a common concern that I'd like to resume in this way. How can we not only accept, but fully develop the critique of historicism and of the dialectic of history intended as a teleological process? The problem has been at the core of a large part of German philosophy for a long time, in particular at the center of Walter Benjamin's critique in his attacks to the positivist, historicist, and social democratic positions. Everybody knows the texts by Benjamin, where he writes, I quote, Marx said that revolutions are the locomotive of world history, but perhaps things are very different. It may be that revolutions are the act by which the human race traveling in a train applies the emergency brake. Benjamin refers to the image of the train to indicate the idea of progress. But what interests him in this train is the emergency brake. As Enzo Traverso has also recently pointed out, for Benjamin, revolutions are this emergency brake which human beings traveling on the train sometimes applies. In other words, Benjamin combines the idea of progress with the idea of catastrophe, of storm. As he maintains in the 9th thesis on the philosophy of history, where he writes this storm is what we call progress. And in the 11th thesis, he adds, I quote, this is a little bit long. The conformism, which has been part and parcel of social democracy from the beginning, attaches not only to its political tactics, but to its economic views as well. It is one reason for its nature breakdown. The Gotha program already bears traces of this confusion, defining labor as the source of all wealth and all culture. Smelling a rat, Marx countered that. The man who possesses no other property than his labor power must of necessity become the slave of other men who have made themselves the owners. However, the confusion spread, and soon thereafter, Joseph Ditzgen proclaimed, the savior of modern times is called work. The improvement of labor constitutes the wealth which is now able to accomplish what no redeemer has ever been able to do. This vulgar Marxist conception of the nature of labor bypasses the question of how its products might benefit the workers, while still not being at their disposal. It recognizes only the progress in the mastery of nature, not the retrogression of society. It already displays the technocratic features later encountered in fascism. End quote. But these questions I'm referring to by quoting Benjamin have been not only at the core of the German philosophy, probably since the time of Nietzsche, but they have also been at the center of the operaist reflection in the early 1960s. The critique of historicism, of the idea of progress, of emancipation, was directly or indirectly the starting point for the operaist reflection too. But in this tradition, this critique took at least two different trajectories. I'm interested in, to which I refer by name, them Spinozist and Heideggerian Nietzschean traditions. Both perspectives were at work in the operaist tradition, although they have evolved in different ways, and nowadays, for several reasons, the Spinozist one has become dominant. Before getting into this history, let me briefly recall what operaism is or has been for a long time. The term operaism, English translation of the Italian word operaismo, sometimes in English also translated as workerism, refers to a political and cultural tradition that can be traced back to political and theoretical practices emerging in Italy in the early 1960s. Operaism is nowadays a globally well-known current of thought. The publication of prominent works such as Empire, you can go through because at least there is a list. Empire, Multitude, Commonwealth, an Assembly by Michael Hart and Antonio Negri has contributed to it. Moreover, the publication and translation into English and other languages of similar works by other workerists such as Kristen Marazzi, Paolo Virno, Maurizio Lazzarato, Maria Rosa dalla Costa, and Sita Federici, to name only a few, have established operaism on an international scale. Operaism is not a unitary political theory. It does not refer to a school of thought, nor to a single political subject. It is rather the encounter of multiple and diversified pathways in which we can recognize some common roots. Operaism pays a specific attention to the function of subjectivity. It describes political and social processes as intrinsically ambivalent and considers the ideas of conflict, dissent, or transformation as crucial elements for interpreting the changes of our contemporary societies. The attention operaists pay to the dimension of subjectivity can be traced back to the primary importance they have attributed to the notion of class composition, just as concept. Okay? The notion of class composition since the beginning of the movement. This dimension was already important in the Italian workerism of the early 1900s. This was a kind of workerism imbued with the anarcho-syndicalist positions of Georges Sorel and the experience of the newspaper Ordine Nuovo, co-edited by Antonio Gramsci. It referred to the subjective figure of the professional worker, in which the handcrafted skill with its know-how still played an important role, although this professional worker was about to be integrated in the factory. When the term workerism is employed today, one immediately thinks of the kind of political and theoretical experience which emerged in the post-war years, or more precisely in Italy in the early 1960s. Crucial works such as Workers and Capital by Mario Tronti and the political work around the Italian journal Quaderni Rossi, which counted among its founders Raniero Panzieri, Romano Acquati, and Danilo Montaldi, can be considered as the pillars of the initial experience of operaism. If, on the one hand, the question of class composition and of subjectivity was still crucial in the new form of operaism of the 1960s, on the other, the new workerism broke with the previous form since it introduced a new concept and practice centered on the idea of the refusal work. In the workerism of the early 1900s, there was still an idea of the pride of producers towards their own activity. This pride could not but disappear with the theorization of the refusal of work. This refusal was not only political theorization, but the acknowledgement that the working class refused the work discipline imposed in the factories. Through political interventions in the factories based on the method of con-ricerca, operaists could show that workers hated their work and refused their condition as workers. This refusal work functioned as an impulse for political and social transformation. In this connection, workerism was breaking with an ideology based on an ethics of work that has been the ideological cement of all socialist and communist traditions. Operaists paid special attention to the great transformation of the capitalistic mode of production. In the 1960s and throughout the 1970s, there were important changes of the mode of organization of work in the factories. A new class composition and a new subjective figure were about to emerge. The traditional figure of the professional worker was disappearing, since automated processes centered on the employment of machines were replacing it. The assembly line, a pillar of the Fordist mode of production, did not require a professional worker anymore, but rather an unskilled worker who could perform repetitive, alienated, and standardized tasks. This new figure of the worker, which emerged in the so-called Fordist stage of capitalism, was centered on the figure of the mass worker, as the operaists called it. While the transformation of the reality of capitalism was not at the center of the interests of the classical left-wing political organizations, it was, in contrast, the main interest of groups of intellectuals, activists, and researchers who conducted their first inquiries in the factories. These experiences contributed to the emergence of the trajectory of operaism. The operaists looked at new forms of struggles that were invisible to traditional working class organizations. Being unable to see the new forms of resistance, of alliances, of active struggle, the classical socialist and communist organizations could assume that struggles were simply not taking place, or that the working class was slumbering. On the contrary, the operaists were able to bring to light the multiplicity of new forms of struggle, refusal of work, sabotage, individual and collective resistance to the organization of the factory discipline. A new microphysical landscape of resistance was emerging. It was this new landscape that the eruption of 1968 couldn't but enlarge. In fact, 1968 was the eruption of a new cycle of struggles which were no longer based only on the opposition between the working class and capital, but also on conflicts involving several other issues: culture, imagination, language, forms of life, reproduction. Until 1968, while analyzing the form of class composition, workerists have focused on the figure of the mass worker. It's okay. Mass workers were migrants, mainly coming from the South. The cultural stereotype, still persisting today, consisted in depicting them as poor guys, victims of modernity and of underdevelopment. But the inquiries of the operaists produced a completely different account of the situation. To be sure, operaists also described the suffering and the state of deprivation of the migrants. But they also drew attention to the fact that these migrants were forced to move in the search for new forms of life by desires, needs, and curiosity that gave them the power to flee from the misery of the peasant condition, even though this flight could also assume the guise of an illusory search for mass consumerism. These new subjects were not politicized and did not enter the classical political organizations. Reactionary forces as well as socialist and classical communist organizations, targeted them as lazy-bones, opportunists, and reactionary subjects. In contrast, the operaists understood that behind these forms of opportunism, there was a refusal of the work and its ethics, and also a refusal of the political and trade union representation. As a result, operaists were overturning a picture that had dominated the whole socialist and communist tradition. If the working class has always been presented as a victim, as a passive subject, on which the development of capital imposes its own laws, if it has been reduced to an exploited labor force, the operaists were overturning this thesis by showing that capitalist development is subordinated to the working class struggle. The logic is reversed. Movements, individual and collective resistance, oblige capital to resist, to invent new forms of exploitation and new forms of organization of labor in order to bridle the force of living labor. The mass worker was a figure on the edge of a structural passage of capitalism. It was a thread stretched between two processes. If the professional worker had been replaced by the mass worker through the processes which brought about the factory, the introduction of automated processes, the decentralization of factories, and the diffusion of production in the whole of society were contributing to the disappearance of the figure of the mass worker and to its replacement through the figure of the social worker, i.e. the worker who no longer works or not only works in the factory, but is employed in different fields in the whole of society. This is what was at issue in several political interventions by Antonio Negri in the 1970s. In particular, his long interview on operaism, published in 1979, brilliantly sums up the thesis. However, this new figure needed to be better defined. We could say that operaism becomes neo-operaism, new operaism, when it starts reflecting on the passage from the social worker to the definition of a new subject, a new class composition centered on the idea of the cognitive worker or cognitive labor. Post-operaism or new operaism elaborated on this definition, involving the new characterization of labor activity as centered on cognitive labor. In this connection, post or new operaism starts analyzing the capitalist passage towards a post-Fordist society. To some extent, post-operaism was fueled by the Italian community in exile in Paris, which gave birth, among other projects, to the political experience of the French journal Futur Antérieur, starting in the early 1990s, which also converged with many other intellectual experiences coming from French philosophical and political discussion. Post-Fordism appears as the age of capitalism, which was able to metabolize the critique and the antagonistic charge of the movements which struggled against the Fordist society. The critique of wage labor, the flight from the factory prison, and from the assembly line, flexibility as a keystone of the critique practiced by political movements in the 1970s, were assumed and reversed by the capitalistic counter-revolution, which started in the 1980s and which brought with it new forms of exploitation. If flexibility in the 1970s signified the possibility to conquer new spaces of freedom, to liberate oneself from the slavery of the factory regime, then in the 1980s, it became a new regime of exploitation that took the form of precarity, a political attack on the conditions of life of people. The passage from Fordism to post-Fordism was orchestrated by the capitalist counter-revolution, but it was orchestrated as an answer to the struggles of the political and social movements. If the mass work was the political subject who determined the crisis of the Fordist society, post-operaism is nowadays struggling in order to define the new political subject who will be able to determine the crisis of the Fordist, of the post-Fordist system. But let me now come into more specific philosophical details by taking into account aspects of the imperialism that are less known or which remain hidden for several reasons. I do that by referring to the work of Nicola Massimo De Feo, who was an Italian philosopher who died in 2002, and whose work is almost unknown, since it has not yet been translated into any other major language. To my view, at stake in De Feo's work are a considerable number of questions that remain unresolved in contemporary political philosophy. They are not only aporetic issues, but also they really constitute a challenge for contemporary philosophy. Let me try to mention the points of theoretical interest in this work. But let me also start by saying that the work of De Feo is irremediably linked to the historical conjuncture that produced it, the political and intellectual history of the 1960s and 1970s. I say that because if by any chance this work is translated into English at some point, it would put the English reader before a theoretical and linguistic difficulty that has to do with the specific conjuncture in which it was produced. Why read this work today? There are many reasons for that I will try to clarify in my account. De Feo started his philosophical reflection in the late 1950s, focusing on the philosophies of Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. He thus participates, among other things, in the process of denazification of Nietzsche's work. In Italy, as much as in France, there was a generation of schools who was attempting to flee Hegel, to flee the dangers of the Hegelian thought, whether through logic or epistemology, whether through Marx or through Nietzsche, as Michel Foucault points out, whether through Heidegger or through Kierkegaard, I would like to add to that. De Feo is among those authors who never stopped consciously or unconsciously to reflect on Hegelianism, because he knew, allow me here to quote the beautiful formula used by Jacques Derrida with regard to Georges Bataille: on ne peut pas méconnaître ou traiter à la légère l'hegelianisme et toutes ces immenses ressources d'enveloppement. In English, the translation is slightly different, but it's perfect. Absolutely perfect. De Feo, as many authors of that time, could not avoid confronting these issues, that is to say, with the attempt to flee Hegel and Hegelianism. As many other authors, De Feo engages his reflection in the trajectory of the critique of historicism and of the dialectic of history as well. But unlike Walter Benjamin, I think that what was at issue in his philosophy, as also in the general approach of the operaism, was a critique of historicism, not necessarily resulting in an idea of catastrophe, as in Benjamin's critique. For sure, this was the main issue of a considerable number of operaists: how to think the Marxian growth of the productive forces which may break the capitalistic relations of production without ceding to a teleological idea of progress. In this regard, the Field's critique, unlike that of other operalists, seems hesitating between two poles. His position is less resolved. On the one hand, the Field does not cease to emphasize the destructive character inherent in the technological apparatus of capital. Indeed, it shows that the entire destructiveness of capitalism as inherent in the historical structure of domination that stems from the auto-technological structure of modernity. Let me quote a passage from one of the works of the Field in which he focuses on processes of reification in order to criticize them. So, onnipotenza del dominio tecnologico, di cui il capitale si serve, estrema mistificazione del suo potere disperato di pianificazione per riprodurre il sistema dell'universale espropriazione come sussunzione reale e soppressione della vita nell'ordine nihilistico della distruzione nucleare, ma da cui pure trae la propria forza. It's quite difficult in Italian too, I must confess. So also in Italian, so these sentences are a little bit too complicated. It's a little bit like post one page without any punctuation. So you can go on, please. Accumulandola nella forma dispotica dell'autonomia tecnologica, della produttività del lavoro morto e del sistema di simulacri delle forze distruttive, è costretto a riprodurre, allargando a tutta la società il plusvalore dell'universale sovversione sociale e della sua egemonia dissolutiva. That's okay. We stay here. So, so it's a complicated quote, but I think that we can resume that. Or what I think is interesting here is that in the Field's idea, the idea of the Field is an idea of catastrophe. So the catastrophe is very important. So this technological development of capitalism is catastrophic. So in that sense, it's very close to Walter Benjamin on one side. The idea that capitalism is a system of destructive forces with point of no return is at the bottom of the analysis. But on the other hand, he also states, next slide, only workers' action for needs is revolutionary because it pursues the destruction of exploitation and oppression that labor and the state order reproduce. And it is the struggle that produces, stimulates, and triggers real transformation of the system. And so, catastrophe on one side, but this hope, if you want, we have to discuss about that the subjectivity, the revolutionary subjectivity would also overcome the process. This means that the theory recognizes, on one side, the destructive character of technology and of the idea of progress. He attacks the needs of modernity and shows the real character of exploitation involved in the capitalistic relations, but at the same time, he does not think of revolution as an emergency break. Nor does it seem to me that his position paves the way for theories of degrowth. The theory refers to the power of revolutionary subjectivity to the social and political movements as resources that can destroy the destructiveness of the capitalistic power relations. It seems to me that the Field's position touches on points of heresy, but his heresy must be framed and discussed within an auseinandersetzung with what remains of the operist tradition. Put differently, the Field too is faced with the problem of how to think about the marching power of the productive forces which break the relations of production after Benjamin's critique, but his account goes neither in the direction of Benjamin's critique nor in that of the potency of the multitude. I say Defeo too is faced with this problem of how to think about the Marxian power of the productive forces which break the relations of production, since it was not the only one. The problem is, for example, at the heart of the operaist reflection in the early 1960s. And here I would like to recall what Mario Tronti wrote in number 2 of the Quaderni Rossi. La rivoluzione operaia non deve avvenire dopo, quando il capitalismo è già crollato nella catastrofe di una crisi generale, né può venire prima, quando il capitalismo non ha neppure cominciato il suo specifico ciclo di sviluppo. Può e deve avvenire contemporaneamente a questo sviluppo. Deve presentarsi come componente interna dello sviluppo e al tempo stesso come sua interna contraddizione. Defeo is aware of these problems, but in the period ranging from the 1960s to the 1970s, he still reflects on them in a contradictory way. This is due to the fact that his reflection is deeply affected by the context of the discussion with which his work is imbued at that time. This context of discussion has to be referred to the phenomenological currents centered on the reading of the work of Edmund Husserl. Defeo's early readings of the work of Heidegger, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard are for sure revolutionary for his time, but they also fit in those philosophical approaches that will become dominant in a large part of contemporary philosophy. Defeo's reading is deeply imbued with Husserlian phenomenology, and in particular with the reading of the crisis, and poses the humanistic problem of the creation of a new man, of a new human being. But Defeo feels uneasy in this philosophical dispositive. The discomfort grows, his discontent grows. Perhaps he does not yet have the language to express what he cannot yet know, but his discontent in the theoretical framework of contemporary philosophy is manifest and also involves his critique of the political apparatus of the academia. Defeo soon realized that the philosophical pathway in which he himself had engaged his reflection in the 1960s led philosophy to a self-referential dead-end street in which political and militant research was, from the outset, blocked. One needs to bring new elements from praxis and historical research into philosophy. One needs to get out of philosophy in order to remain within it. This is Defeo's first intuition, which will allow him, malgré lui, to link his philosophical trajectory to the currents of thought that weigh in contemporary philosophy the most. But still in the early 1970s, this could not be done to the full because the research still takes place under the remnants of the reading of the crisis of the European sciences. Defeo approaches the work of Karl Marx through the powerful readings of Lukács and Max Weber, but his approach to Marx remains timid. He writes in 1971 in his interesting book on Weber and Lukács. After Marx and against Marx, I quote, and his theory of socialist proletarian revolution, bourgeois thought began to use the social sciences not only to refute, by deforming it, the theory of dialectical historical materialism, but also to eternalize itself, constructing through the social sciences an image of social historical reality in which real contradictions seem natural and necessary, through the atomization of praxis and of its theoretical reflection in specialized disciplines, increasingly formalistically closed and independent in their and functional autonomies. historiography, economics, sociology. The phenomenological legacy affects here the whole interpretation. The break with the phenomenological tradition has, however, occurred, and it will exert its full influence on the field's coming work. Although the field's language is still steeped in phenomenological research, and the problems still seem to be posed at the level of the horizon of meaning and the search for new meaning, in reality, the field has internalized and metabolized quite other teachings that come from the Heideggerian research. Let's try to summarize some elements of these teachings here. Heidegger's philosophy, like Nietzsche's, irreversibly shatters the ground and the myth of modernity, and paved the way for anti-modernity in contemporary thought. In doing so, Heidegger marks his inevitable distance from Hegel. But it is not only the distance from Hegel that Heidegger marks, it is the distance from the whole of modern philosophy. Secondly, Heidegger's philosophy radically breaks, at least after being in time, and after the discussions with Cassirer around Kant and the problem of metaphysics, with the transcendental, and opens up to a kind of radical immanence. Heidegger affirms existence in its facticität, and thus excludes any danger of teleology. Existence is presence, contingency, facticity. De Feo insists on this from the outset. Unlike many of his contemporaries, even to the extent of including Pierre Bourdieu in France, De Feo is not interested in historicizing Heidegger's thought in order to show how Heidegger's philosophy is rooted in late bourgeois ideologies based on ideas of catastrophism. De Feo never misses an opportunity to remark that Heidegger's philosophy is deeply conservative, reactionary, fascist, and national fascist, socialist. Nor does he miss the fact that his anti-bourgeois and anti-democratic critique, unlike Nietzsche's, is weighted to the most reactionary and conservative forces in the social world. Heidegger is reactionary and fascist. De Feo knows this, as does Toni Negri. And neither De Feo nor Negri refuse to read Heidegger for this reason. If Antonio Negri se méfie de Heidegger comme de la peste, if he's worried of Heidegger, if his mistrust of this philosophy is insurmountable, the reason is due to the fact that Heidegger's philosophy is the suffocation of life. Although Heidegger rejects the transcendental, brings being back down to earth, i.e. in its factual presence, and opens up Dasein to the possibilities that are in the future, Heidegger closes this whole process when he shows that the most proper possibilities are to be found in death. De Feo, however, does not close the door on Heidegger, and we will see that this configures the possibility of another pathway in the Operist tradition. Firstly, for De Feo, Heidegger is the thinker of real subsumption in the 20th century. He is the thinker who grasps the specific character of the capitalist movement of rationalization. By destroying the anthropological and instrumental conception of technology, the faith and confidence in the possibility that the human being may control and dominate technology, Heidegger shows the abstract and impersonal character of the productive forces and the relations of production. Heidegger becomes arguably the most topical interpreter of the technological devastation, which she describes in the form of the abandonment of being, the flight of gods, machination, calculation, and speed as hallmarks of the nihilism that envelops the totality of being. Heidegger is certainly not the only one to have dwelt on these aspects. Whether it be Nietzsche or the theorists of the Frankfurt School, Jean-Paul Sartre or Max Weber, Ernst Bloch or Marcuse, there are numerous authors, according to De Feo, who have highlighted in their very different research the technical devastation and process of massification that dominate our societies. But all these authors, it must be emphasized, ended up freezing or even overturning the understanding of the processes they were analyzing into an ideology of the totalitarian and technological domination of capital. The uninterrupted revolution to which Marx refers in his work to indicate the development of the productive forces, the constant increase in circulation and production, the growth of social productivity through science and technical progress has come to be interpreted as the violent moment through which domination is established and perpetuated. Instead of seeing the extent to which Marx had indicated the unstable points and the fragility of the relations of force which run through capitalist society, his analyses were locked into the image of totalitarian and objective domination, in which capitalist appropriation never ceases to separate producers from their product and thus to deepen social alienation. It took the revolt of a generation and the work of inquiry in front of the factories to turn philosophy over and place it on its feet. For many, operaism was a breath of fresh air. And indeed, we would not know how to dwell on Heidegger if we don't let him meet Marx. If on the one hand, it is true that Heidegger's analysis, by describing the abstract and impersonal character of the productive forces and relations of production, fixes the specific content of the crisis of the capitalist rationalization, on the other hand, in order to highlight its full disruptive content, it is necessary to overturn his analysis and relate it to the analysis outlined by Marx in the Grundrisse. How can Heidegger help to outline a different reading of Marx? Heidegger makes it possible to strip Marx away from Hegel, and by the same token, from the political neutralization that European social democracy and German sociology has been realizing for decades. De Feo writes, I think is the previous one, yeah, exactly, yeah. This one. So,
Let's look at it all. No. We have.
yeah, this one.
So that.
This one.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Marxism as a theory explaining the dynamics of the development of the productive forces and the relations of production, once freed from its critical function as a theory of proletarian revolution and the crisis of the system, becomes for Max Weber and Werner Sommer the most adequate theoretical instrument for this purpose, its use for capitalist development. End quote. This is a first point, using Heidegger to strip Marx away from these reformist uses. But the second point is that the Heideggerian critique, when reversed and brought into contact with the Marxian analysis of the productive forces, sheds new light on the processes of capitalist rationalization. This contact between Marx and Heidegger has nothing to do with the attempts that were made in Germany by Herbert Marcuse or Otto Koehler, or in France by the Greek-born philosopher Kostas Axios. It is rather in the theoretical conjuncture opened by the operaist tradition that this confrontation with Marx can assume its full potential. But it is also true that within the operaist tradition, the field represents a very particular turning point, since through his position, he distances himself from Mario Tronti and his theories about the autonomy of the political, but also from Antonio Negri, even though the field could not but feel the intensity of an intellectual community in Negri's proximity. But how can we sketch out the differences between the two positions within the traditions of operaism? If Antonio Negri follows the trajectory that leads to consider the compositional mechanisms of the social proletariat, mechanisms that the analysis outlined by Marx would also make possible through his reference to the notion of the social individual in the Grundrisse, the field, on the other side, insists on the mechanisms of division, of fragmentation, which the crisis sets in motion. Let us be clear on this point. The field acknowledges the issue of the revolutionary subjectivity in Marx's Grundrisse. In the third book of the Grundrisse, Marx posits labor as not capital. This definition is in turn twofold, because labor is not objectified labor, i.e. labor that has not yet been realized, labor as promise, if you like, that has not yet produced its work, labor can be conceived both negatively and positively. Negatively, it's absolute poverty, Marx tells us. That is radical poverty which put the subject in a situation of exclusion of objective worth. But on the other hand, Marx also defines labor in a positive way, because labor is activity, a general possibility of worth, a living source of value. Thus, labor is absolute poverty when it is separated from all means and relations of production, general possibility of worth when it is interpreted as activity, as a productive living source of value. It is a duplicity which the concept of subject expresses work, subject in the sense of subjugated, of a cog in the machine of productive relations, subject as subjectivity that produces value and worth. The worker reduced to labor power has a miserable existence. But the poverty of this condition can be overcome through the radical negation of this negativity. If the worker denies her condition as a worker reduced to labor power, the possibility opens up to appropriate his social being as an activity and a living source of value. Negri clarifies that the Grundrisse tells us that there would be no surplus value if there were no surplus labor. But at the same time, Marx also tells us that surplus labor is not capital, creating excess. Of course, one wonders why this power relationship cannot be completely dominated, and likewise, why the power of living labor is irreducible. Negri answers this objection by taking Spinoza's philosophy into account and anchoring the irreducibility of living labor in the conatus. Allow me for a moment to dwell on this position of Negri's, because it permits me to clarify almost in a symmetrical way how the Feuille's position traces another pathway in the operaist tradition. Forgive me, however, for the inevitable shortcuts and simplification that I introduced into the analysis. Negri interprets conatus as an element that operates without needing to be linked to any transcendental principle, because it is a capacity and a power as potenza, which allows human beings to direct their existence toward freedom, towards an increase in their own power as a capacity to act. On the basis of this interpretation, the conatus becomes the motor for the establishment of a coming community. The conatus does not derive its power from something external to it, but the principle that animates it is immanent to it, as if this capacity of appropriation were inherent in human beings. This is perhaps what we might call, if we wanted to use an expression, next one, okay, used by Katja Diefenbach, Negri's anthropologism, which brings him closer to the marks of the manuscripts and distances him from Althusser and all his criticisms of anthropological and humanist notions. According to Diefenbach, through his interpretation of the conatus, Negri brings into Marxism all those concepts from which Althusser had freed himself. Jacques Rancière probably also takes the same critical line when he states that Negri reactivates the union between materialism and idealism because he reintroduces into materialism the concepts of subjectivity and appropriation, concepts from which the Althusserian tradition had freed itself. This is evident in the central thesis of the savage anomaly, in which the idea that power increases the capacity of human beings to act and exist is inscribed in the conatus, which drives towards a multiplication of cooperative being. In this regard, Martin Sarr, also the next one, asks, aber wer garantiert die friedliche Konvergenz der verschiedenen Interessen der Mitglieder der Multitude? Und wer kann vorhersehen, dass sie sich bei allen zugestandenen Differenzen demokratisch organisieren wird? In other words, what allows Negri to say that the multitude will not become mobs, what allows him to say that the multitude will push towards democratization, to what transcendent principle, Martin Sarr insists on that, can such a conviction be anchored? We have seen that the answer to such an objection is in the conatus, but Martin Sarr's objections goes further. According to the author in his book, Immanenz der Macht, Negri does not grasp the most essential point of the Spinozist immanent argument, which is the contingency of relations. The fact that all power relations are contingent. This aspect is neutralized by Negri when he projects a democratizing capacity onto the multitude. I don't know whether these criticisms hit the nail on the head. It seems to me that they fail to grasp the meaning of the concept of democracy used by Negri, a concept that is based on the contingency of the class struggle. But I will leave this point for now because I'm interested in coming back to the field. And the point I wanted to make through the reference to Negri is the following one. It seems to me that Negri gives a particular trajectory to operaism which stems precisely from the way he cut all alliances with the Heideggerian Nietzschean critique. He got rid of that tradition by closing it into the single formula of being towards death, which he distrusted above all else. But in doing so, he also renounces that trajectory of contemporary philosophy, which made of contingency its necessity. And in doing so, he also deprived himself of a philosophical tool that would have allowed him to fully grasp the critique of all forms of anthropologization and to anchor his philosophy in the forms of contingency, of which this philosophical tradition was the bearer. In this way, he does not escape what Michel Foucault calls the constant anthropologism of Western thought, namely the fact of going in search of the foundation of subjectivity as the root of a positive self. In his interpretation of Marx, De Feo follows a different trajectory because he anchors the liberation of the possible in the destruction of present values without, however, giving this movement any ontological foundation, but instead anchoring it in a radical contingency. By freeing historical analysis from any transcendental hypostasis of meaning and by accepting what happens in history as innocence of becoming, De Feo on the one hand renounces the critique of the rationality or irrationality of the system conducted in accordance with values hypostatized by consciousness, and on the other attributes to the oppressed forces of the body the capacity and potential to produce meaning and create value through the destructive movement of the present state of things. For many, De Feo's position becomes all the more unacceptable because it indicates the non-necessity of any compositional mechanism. De Feo's communism is a Nietzschean one, not a utopian communism. It is a communism rooted in movements, in history, a communism doomed to madness when restricted to individual experience, but ready to create a collective dimension when rooted in the revolutionary experience of movements. A communism for all and now, which creates the possibility of creating new values, but in itself is not the bearer of already defined values. It is a heretical and aporetic communism, a communism that is not the expression of a determined organization, nor is the product of a political project. De Feo is humanly attracted by the multiplicity of marginalized, of excluded, of invisible people. His work is haunted by misery and despair, depicted in the form of abjection and degradation of the human condition. But he is interested in these forms of human degradation, not on the basis of a sense of romanticism, but because, for him, these forms constitute the foundation on which its existence rests. Thank you.
Wonderful. So we already have the first question. I just wanted to say quickly, you raise your hands here and to indicate if you want to raise a question. I also am ready to have a question. Formulate one. I hope that the acoustic situation works also the other way around. Let's figure that out. Zana Naki, please come in. Let's see if that's.
Oh. I hope you can hear me. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for this very informative presentation from which I've learned a lot and I've taken many notes. I have a very basic question about integrational gesture that you had. I don't know if you could just name it as such, but I think that it has a quite an importance in your whole presentation, that you have begun with a comparison between Marx and Benjamin, and you said that for Benjamin, and you gave this analogy, that the revolution is not a locomotive, but it's an emergency brake. And in the whole expansion of your argumentation, I had the feeling that the gesture somehow falls into what we would call, I would call, or but you would also call probably, a jargon of finitude. And my question is, if you are affirming such a gesture, like the solution is that we have to limit ourselves, just be a bit modest, and just to see that the development is not the way which bring us to anywhere in something like this, then if it is the case, I would like to pose the question, which will be a bit critical, that is, isn't today aren't we facing a situation in which it is proven that the world how it is, the existing order of capital, is very much compatible with this calls of let's be modest, let's consummate a bit less, and so just for the sake of sustainability. And the question is, isn't this sustainability that, like, in this emergency brake, like this is the discourse of today, we have to just put the emergency brake, but we just see that it can very well just maintain the existing order of capital instead of just bringing any revolutionary or emancipatory potential. And I would love to know, what would you say about this? I mean, and last thing is, shouldn't we need today an affirmation of another form of infinity, an infinity which is not a bad infinity of capitalism, but a true infinity, as Badiou would say, let's say?
Shall I answer?
Yes.
Thank you very much for your question. It is not just to immediately get your sympathy, but I think that we are saying precisely the same thing. So this was precisely the end of my talk. That is to say that, well, I started, of course, with this quote by Benjamin, because I tried to say that, well, there was in modern or in contemporary philosophy, to some extent, let's say, of course, in a very general way, starting probably from Nietzsche, but in the philosophy of the 20th century, a strong criticism of the tradition of historicism and of theories of progress or based on an idea of teleology, and this was my main reference to Benjamin, in order also to say that, well, these issues were at the core also of other political and philosophical traditions, like, for instance, operaism. Just as a theological remark, operaist authors, well, it's really a poverty of this movement, but there is really no quote at all of Benjamin. So there is really also in the fields of Benjamin is totally absent. So, but I think that, well, independent from that, I think that, well, the operists were also working to some extent on the same problematic, that is to say, how can we escape an idea of progress, an idea of historicism? But then the solution is absolutely different, because for operists and also for De Feo, revolution is absolutely not an emergency brake. That, if I correctly understood your question, this emergency brake could also be totally compatible with a capitalistic society, right? So this is what you meant, and I agree with that. No? I agree with that. So why not? Probably it's what is at issue precisely today in different discourses that risk to become absolutely dominant. But there I see a distinction precisely between Benjamin and the operaist tradition. Of course, it remains the huge problem that, well, some theories, some operaist theories are at any rate based on an idea of force, of strength, of craft, of productive forces.
I'm sorry, just to get a clear statement. But what will, if you just say it in a short sentence, what will be the proposition of the operists, so that I could just be sure that I got the message, let's say?
That within the system itself, there always is a force, there is always something, but within the system, working against the system. And it's precisely this contradiction that will bring something new.
Thank you. I'm just stepping in with I think slightly from a slightly different perspective. I thought, I mean, if I got one of your points correctly, then I think you very strongly indicated that Heidegger's account of technology can make us understand what happens within the history of the reception of Marx. Namely, Marx became technology in the bad sense, when Marx became Marxist social science, Zombards and Weber. I mean, and then you make the move, basically saying, Heidegger also teaches us how to overcome that. So there is a reification of Marx, right? And of course, I mean, state Marxism, right? In all its problematic forms, and then, I mean, I think the quote you gave indicated that this reification happens when Marxism or Marxist thought loses its critical force, right? I mean, so you get Marx, but it doesn't cost you anything anymore, right? You get the thing without the substance of the thing or something. And that is linked to what technology does, if I understand correctly. And then you make the move, and I'd like to understand this move better. Then you make the move that Heidegger offers us an account of that, but Heidegger can also offer us almost like a normative account what we can do to deal with that problem. And that is, if I understand correctly, to get rid of everything in Marx that is weirdly transhistorical, or that itself lends itself to being reified, so to speak, right? Everything that remains, but maybe I'm wrong, everything that remains stable, like the assumption that there is a subject of the revolution, that there is a substance of people, that there is something, even a form of practice. And at that point, the conatus came in, I think. Was that the argument? So does the conatus solve the demands that we can derive from Heidegger's critique of technology to think through Marx in a non-reifying way, in a non-doctrinal way, in a way that remains open to historical contingency? Was that the move? Is that what you think? How one can read the operaismal tendency? Is that what you would say?
Well, thank you for it's a very important question, and I think it's quite important to have these moments of discussions to present this work in progress too, because I learned a lot from the discussion, and also to see the weak points of an expose. Let me say that, well, I didn't quote, but well, this part on Heidegger, part of this development is also would be very interesting also to look at Negri, Spinoza and us. So in this book, Spinoza and us, there is an article by Negri on Heidegger and Spinoza, and that you have interesting points about this issue too. But there was a moment in my expose where I also said that the position by the field as not to be confused with interesting approaches like, but very old approaches also like Marcuse or Otto Pögler, because there was also this German school where they tried to put together Marx and Heidegger. But I think that in that time it was also the, let's use this word after saying word conjunction. This philosophical conjunction was also a little bit very imbued with humanistic perspectives. And then there was this insistence on Heidegger's critique of technology. This was the main issue. That is to say that, well, in particular, the first part of the work of Heidegger also stresses how modernity develops a process this is not the word used by Heidegger, but forms of reification, of massifications. There are also wonderful pages in being time on these processes. And this has always been the main contact, let's say so, between Marx and Heidegger. That is to say that Heidegger too is conservative author, whatever you want, but he also describes this massification, this general reification of society, like Marx does. I think that, well, De Feo was interested in a step further. And if you want, this comes precisely after the Kegel, the turning point in Heidegger, after 1936, and precisely so in his confrontation with Nietzsche. That is to say, what De Feo finds in Heidegger is not precisely this question of technology that is so crucial, although I refer to that. But it was what also is the starting point of the critique of Negri. Heidegger, like Spinoza, Negri also says, is an author that who criticized the transcendental perspective. And so he allows us to found philosophy in an immanent form. And so this insistence on facticität, so all these elements are elements that, well, describes a plane of immanence. This is the first thing. Now, De Feo will add to that something else. That is to say that for De Feo, there is in Heidegger's philosophy the huge use of negativity. Let's say that with Jacques Derrida in a sense of radical negativity. That is to say a negativity that cannot be subsumed at any rate. So it's no more, if you want, this is precisely the point, if it is no more the negativity like in Hegel, but it's a negativity that is radical. It's the autonomy of this negativity, this absolutely autonomy. And in that sense, well, the process of why put together Heidegger with Marx, in order to read Marx no more in connection with Hegel. This is the starting point of the question. So, but of course, if we want to remain in a philosophical framework, for De Feo was of course also the sociologist and the political issue very important, because Marx has been used by the communist and socialist tradition in a way that is a reformist one, where the negativity of his analysis is the motor for the development of capitalism. So what brings the analysis of Heidegger in that is the fact that this negativity is always a moment of crisis. It's a radical crisis that cannot be overcome. And this is the aspect on which he insists. And to some extent, well, for me, for my education, I would say, without knowing that very well, I think that, well, this is also the starting point for a lot of discussions. Probably the work of Foucault or Althusser was born in this constellation that emerged with the Heidegger's philosophy.
Yeah. I was just, maybe just to add a very quick note to this, I was just wondering, I mean, because if Heidegger's account of technology allows to say how to undo a critical component by transcendentalizing it, right? I mean, by transcendentalizing history, there are laws of history, right? That's what I mean. And by insisting that something can never be transcendentalized, right? That's the absolute negativity. Could one not say that must lead to a different account of technology also? I mean, somehow, right? I mean, that there is a problematic way of conceiving of what technology is. But there is, I mean, the Grundrisse and the fragments of the machine and right, the whole general internet kind of stuff. I mean, that gives a rise to another conception, maybe, of technology, right? And so
yeah. But in my development, so there was a moment where I was also saying that, well, this question of technology in Heidegger, and not only in Heidegger's, but in a lot of other thinkers, for this to be totally blocked in a conception of totality and of a totalitarian power.
Yeah.
And for many authors, this is of course linked with the modern time of the capitalistic society, but for Heidegger, then it's a metaphysical question, since technology has to do precisely with development of the West, but also in a very totalitarian way. And this point has to be, of course, criticized through us.
Okay. Thank you. Do we have any more comments, questions, things you want to raise? I see full acceptance and submission somewhere in this room. Does anyone else? I have one more thing I could raise that only if need be. Okay, what I was interested in Nietzschean communism.
Yeah.
For none and for all, because it's non-compositional, you said, right? I mean, so it's not made up of atoms, but it is a form of organizing what is brought into existence by organizing it, if I understand correctly. Right? So it's not like we have a social basis that is already made up and objective, but it is. Does that mean it's a process of, I mean, a constant process of subjectivization somehow? Could one say that? I mean, it is just like one is fabricating perpetually fabricating and adding to a communist subject. Could that mean, let me put it differently, it's not a body without organs, but a body with potentially infinitely many organs. Right? I mean, and that's how the early Marx, for example, describes inventions, right? I mean, he basically says, with the invention of music, we invent a musical ear. It didn't exist before, right? But when music was invented, something. So in some sense, one could say, right, we invent additional organs because organs are centers somehow of new potencies or manifestations of new connections established or new capacities generated. Does that make sense to you? I mean, or is that the wrong direction?
Well, let me say, of course, you know, Paul, that this is also recently quote. It is also Michel Foucault in an interview with Lucio Tombadori, where he makes an overview about his philosophical trajectory. This is an interview from the early 1980s, where he used precisely this sentence of this formulation. So I was a Nietzschean communist in the 1950s. And it was, this situation was to me unbearable. It is to say that to be homosexual, communist, and Nietzschean in France in the 1950s were absolutely impossible. And he used that precisely to say, well, I've been for a couple of years when I was a student at the École Normale under the direction, by the way, also of Althusser in the Communist Party, but this was not my thing. Because my solitude or my approach was not the community of the Communist Party, and I was Nietzschean in that sense. But in this definition, there is also an idea of anarchy to some extent. And let me say that in different geographical contexts, of course, this quote takes different meanings too. I understand that perfectly. For instance, I've used myself once in connection with Foucault, this formula, Nietzschean communist, and there was then like a very friendly critique by Etienne Balibar, who interprets that in a totally different way. Because I'm Italian and I come from a country where this tradition of Nietzschean legacy took absolutely another meaning. It's only another meaning. And I understand, for instance, that in Germany is still another question. So to quote Heidegger or Nietzsche, so is totally different. So Nietzschean communism is not a contradiction in itself. For many of us and for the field was the only way to be communist, because well, I cannot say I was part of this community at all, but no, it's the impossible community. It's the fact that, well, you try to have a community, but you cannot have it. So it's this possibility, the possibility that is impossible. So, and it is to some extent, well, also the life of the field, like the life of Nietzsche. Nietzsche, who all the time he speaks about Gesundheit, how do you say that in English? Health, and he was all the time sick. You see this, so he speaks of a collectivity, but he was totally isolated in the mountains of Sicily in Switzerland. And the field, to some extent, was precisely the anti-Negri too. That is to say, an operist that couldn't bear the political organization, but not only the political organization of the ancient communist parties, the political organization of being together, although I want to be with you. But in the moment when I am with you, I'm not myself. So this was this kind of contradiction, like the undertitle of the work of the book by Nietzsche, Zarathustra, a book for all and none. This was this idea of communist, Nietzschean communism. And of course, Nietzschean communism also in the sense that, well, it was in those years, those years of 50s, 60s, targeted, of course, the Stalinist positions, the idea of planning, the projects. So there is a form of anarchy in that. It's an anarchic communism. Not a utopian one at all, but anarchic.
Indeed.
Yeah. I would be really interested to know a little bit about what alliances or connections, if any, there were between the kind of operaism kind of tradition that you're tracing, which was so interesting to hear about, and feminists working at the time who, feminist movements who are thinking about reproductive labor, about domestic labor, but also about processes of marginalization and exclusion. And so I was kind of thinking about the different kind of subjective figures and the way that you were sort of recasting them. And I'm just wondering historically, or out of your own interest, what kind of connections there were, or perhaps not.
Yeah, very interesting. So let me say that, well, in the moment when in the last part of the talk, by referring to the field, I also said that he was interested in these figures of marginalization, marginalized people, these excluded people. Of course, his language is still a language of from the 70s, but I think that, well, what was precisely sketched out in his work, not directly, but I mean as a work that can be done, can be developed, is something that, well, in reality has become dominant, but in a very good way, through feminist positions. Let me take into account one position here that, well, it's a little bit better known since her books now are circulating much more. Silvia Federici, for instance. So Silvia Federici comes precisely from this constellation. She moved to the US at the end of the 60s, but she came precisely from Potere Operaio and so from Padre Rossi, so from this opera installation. And in the US, she developed a project, a zero work, that was based precisely on the position of women in the capitalistic society and the attention that she paid to the question of the reproductive work. So this function of reproduction in the capitalistic society. I think that, well, there is precisely a contact point between what I told you now with reference to the field and these feminist positions. So to say, this my interest also for the field comes, if you want, through these feminist perspectives that allow to take into account again theories that focused in the 70s on this marginalization, on these forms of reproduction. In Silvia Federici or in Maria Rosa dalla Costa, there are analyses that focus on the idea of precarity, for instance. But these are precisely the figures sketched out by De Feo in his work. So there I see really a lot of questions that can be put together.
Okay, we have one more question from one of the online participants. Catherine Everett asks, you can read it yourself, but I'm going to read it out loud. Anyhow, how can workers overcome the obscuring of the alienation of their labor and become self-aware of themselves as workers, i.e. pull the emergency brake from the teleology of history? There seems to be a paradox between alienation, self-awareness, and technology at the workers' cost, i.e. as we become self-aware, the I becomes an other. I'm wondering if there's a way to sustain self-awareness without self-awareness, likewise becoming alienating, and how this tension can apply to workers' revolution. That's not a small question.
Okay. Very interesting questions, because while it seems to me it's also a question, if I can introduce another word now, it's a little bit about the political organization. So how can we organize ourselves? But let me say, and with that, I will start by coming back to philosophical issues, also a little bit what was at issue in your question, Frank. So with Heidegger, I think that in the field with Heidegger it was also important to develop a kind of analysis that to some extent get rid from this dimension of consciousness. So I don't want to say that consciousness is not important at all, not at all. So, but I'd like just to focus also on the other side of the question. Revolutions are not only so these movements where we become conscious of something. So you can also be totally unconscious, and nonetheless you develop a revolutionary approach. So I'm not going to ask workers if they read or read Marx, or women if they read or read Silvia Federici, when they don't accept anymore their position in the household or in society or in a factory. So now we are in an institution like a university, so and by saying that, of course, I'm not in the best position, because consciousness and to become aware, of course, is very important too, of course. But I would say that, I would separate a little bit these two movements, consciousness and unconsciousness. It's not only the only pathway in order to produce a revolution, or revolutions were never probably the result of a prise de conscience. So of course, I think that maybe always a little bit complicated to reconstruct. I say that really in a spin of this term, the series of relationships on which our existence is based. But I think what we need is to understand, if you want to become conscious of processes, to understand what happened in a specific moment. What are the conditions that can produce a new trajectory? So I don't know. I live for an entire existence, and if nothing happens, then I don't know why and how something happens that I cannot grasp precisely, but my existence or my perception of the world changes radically. Can be a word, can be a movie, can be anything you want, But and then I can of course reflect on that. I can of course try to reconstruct all the relations, so the dispositive that allows this transformation. I can do that, but I don't think that what is related only to a form of consciousness. Alienation, of course, is another related issue. I'm totally influenced, I've been in the last 2-3 decades totally influenced by Michel Foucault, I must confess. And in that sense, some concepts like alienation are very problematic to me now. So, because they refer also to forms of essences, of identities, of natural dimensions that I cannot but call, of course, in question. But not that I think that this question of alienation has to be eradicated from the philosophical jargon. I think that there is, of course, a social alienation, but we have to understand that how this is historically produced nowadays, not with reference to a humanistic, of course, dimension. But I don't know if I answered a little bit your question. Was probably more complicated than that.
Okay, I think we've reached the end of the discussion. There are no more questions. Everything has been answered. Everyone is satisfied in the text. And for that very reasons, everyone who is present can join us for a drink at the DCA. If you want to come down, please do. People are online can join us. I have nothing to ameliorate that situation. I'm very sorry. Thank you, Roberto Nigro, very much. Thank you all for attending. Bye.